Broadcast is back, baby.
Oh man, region lock, I hate it. I don't think the Switch has it though.
No, I don't think.
So we talked a little bit about UX, right? So
Yeah.
I want to ask you, especially I think that's interesting, especially for those who are listening. What is UX?
Oh boy. Oh no. So UX stands for user experience, and the definition of user experience depends a lot on who you ask it to. Like different people will have different definitions of it, but the one that I think about is the user experience isn't what's happening in game. It's not what the player is doing. It's the way the player feels when they play the game. So the user experience happens in the player's head. Um, it's when they feel frustrated with something, or when they feel excited about something, or when they manage to understand something easily or not. And the thing you can do, you as a developer, is honing in onto what kind of feeling and experiences you want to give the player. Do you want your players to Where do you want the difficulty for your player? If you're making a rhythm game, you want the difficulty to be managing your reflexes so that you press the right button at the right time. You don't want the difficulty to be finding out which button I have to press. Because you want the buttons to be very clear, and you want the challenge to be, when do I press the button? And that's part of UX. And the reason why it's kind of hard to define what exactly is UX is that UX is everything. It's kind of everything. It's both the way the game mechanics will be experienced by the player. It's how does the sound work for the player. Do you do anything specific with it to invoke emotions in the players? It's something as simple as having a sad music during a sad scene to make the scene sadder. That's user experience. It also involves user interface. Again, back to the question of how clear do you want things to be, and where do you want your players to actually have to search, versus where do you want it to be very easy for the players to do things. And it's also, as I mentioned when we were talking about Mario Rabbids, VFX is also part of user experience, making things as clear as possible for the players, or making things have a bigger impact and feel stronger or less strong is also something that is UX, and that can be changed or modified with good use of VFX.
So basically everything that the player is experiencing. So and so the music, the visual effects, the story as well.
Yeah, the way you present your story, the way you have your players interact with the story, if they have decisions that matter in the story and how you make it matter. It can also be, if you have multiplayer in your game, how do players interact with other players in your multiplayer game? Do you have a chat? How do you handle toxicity in the chat? How do you like, this is the first thing I'm thinking about. There's no way you're gonna have a chat with people and there's not gonna be somebody being a toxic butt in it. So how do you handle toxic players? What do you do to avoid regular players being put together with toxic players? What's your reporting process? How good is it? All of that, UX.
So
And
sorry,
there's a lot
go
of
on.
people who no problem. There's a lot of people who make the connection that UX equals UI. That's how you can see in a lot of job offers. It's looking for a UX/UI designer, and that's like, yeah, the UI is part of UX, but that's not all it is.
But I see how people connect both of them, because user interface is the way that you interact with the game. So that's the thing that requires the better UX from all of them, right? Because that's exactly, like, that's the main thing that you're interacting with. So that's, I think, requires the best UX.
Both yes and no. It's it's the there's a lot of games that have UIs that aren't so present. If you don't have a whole like RPG system where you buy stuff and you have skills and things, maybe your menus is just like an inventory where you just have a list of the 10 things you can collect in the game, and yeah, it's there, but you're not interacting that much with it. As much of the user experience is just how does the game feel? Like,
Mm-hmm.
how do you manage to make, if you have a game that's like a hack and slash, how do you make the attacks feel like they hit something? If you take the difference between a game like Monster Hunter and some beat them up like Devil May Cry, where you actually hit the enemy and you manage to like make them fly, and and in Monster Hunter, it's like in between of it. Like some smaller enemies, you will hit them, you will send them flying. Some bigger enemies, you will just go, Hoppa! And the enemy just stays there. And then at the complete opposite end of the spectrum, you had games like Dark Souls 1, where you would be hitting the enemy, and the enemy would just be turning towards you like you haven't done that much damage to it. And it's all of that is part of how does the experience that your user experience feel.
Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah, makes sense. So it kind of depends on the game, the project.
Yeah.
Okay, okay, okay. And how do you quantify that? How do you like? It's a personal intuition then, basically. A lot of
It's
experience and personal intuition because you need to feel something in order to communicate what you're feeling and how to improve it.
Yeah. So there's the key tool that we have, because uh, nobody that I know and nobody that I have worked with is a mind reader, sadly. That would have made my job way easier. The one thing that we have is doing play tests, user tests,
All right.
uh, where you put the players in front of your game, you take a look at what they're doing, and you then ask them how they actually felt. There's different methodologies because it's kind of a social and psychology science, uh, and there are actual methodologies that have been developed, like uh, simple things like the think aloud process, where you just ask people to speak as they play and tell you how they feel and what they think about things. And that's where you can have players going, I don't know where I'm supposed to go next. What am I supposed to do? I'm gonna talk to that NPC. Maybe he has the rest of the quest. Oh no, that wasn't the guy. I'm lost. And that's where you know, as a developer, like, oh, do we want the to leave the players to wander in that area? Is that fine to us if they like run around for 5 minutes, or do we want them to just get into the place, find the person, do the thing? And that's a designer choice. You make the choice of which kind of experience you want, but then you need to actually have players that play it in order to know how it feels like.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not necessarily something that you do before the release of the game. You can still do it afterwards, especially for live games. It's a lot of the case in like shooter online games, where they get regular feedback from the players, from beta testers, from public test servers, and players will say, "Oh, this felt good. This felt bad. I didn't feel like this was as strong as that." And the key thing, the most important thing, is players, when they tell you how they feel, that's always valid. That's how they feel. Like, they're not lying. They're not saying it felt bad when it actually was kind of nice. If they're saying, I didn't like using this gun, it felt underpowered, or rather, usually players will tell you the gun is underpowered, that's how they felt. It doesn't mean that the gun or the whatever is actually the way the players say it is. You have to look at the actual data and the actual design that you have in place and the actual intention that you want for that design. Um, and I remember reading about a case where the players were complaining about a weapon in a game, I don't remember which game, being not strong enough, that it wasn't, and didn't feel like it was doing enough damage. And the developers looked at the actual data, and there was no significant difference in the win rate between players using that weapon and players using other weapons. So they dug in deeper to find out what was the problem actually, and they found out that it was just a case of the VFX aren't strong enough, intense enough, and so the players feel like the weapon is doing less damage than the other weapons, even though the numbers actually say it's doing the same amount of damage and has the same win-loss ratio. So what they did is they changed the VFX, and then the players saying, "Oh, it's not powerful enough," went, "Cool, it works now."
So, how many playtests do you think would be ideal for a 2-year project, for example?
I think it depends on the breadth and the like
The what?
how big the breadth
The bread? What?
the breadth the amplitude of your project. How
The
big is
okay,
your
okay.
project?
All right, okay.
Uh, if it's a small project, I think you can afford. And also, the important thing is you want to do testing early, as soon as
Mm-hmm.
possible.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and the other aspect of it that dictates how many playtests you can actually get to do is budget, because it costs money to run playtests.
Oh
You
yeah, of
need
course. Okay.
the location, you need the actual researcher who are actually trained to do playtests, because there are specific ways to word the questions and to ask the questions that most people aren't aware of. And you need the same specialist to be able to look at the data and help you analyze it, because you know the game, but you don't necessarily know how to look at all the data and the telemetry that you're getting. And so you want people to do that, and then you actually need to usually give something to the playtesters. And in a lot of cases, it's like a voucher for like 20 quids per hour that they were, or per half day that they were testing the game. So that's a lot of money in the end. You can do playtests without paying people, but that means that you need either a very small playtest that people won't feel like they spent a lot of time, they gave you a lot of time and you're giving them nothing in return, or you need to manage a way to like make them feel special and that they're your friend, but also that's when you can get very biased results. It's always a balancing act. So it's hard to say what is a number. You I don't think you can have too much playtests, but there's a point where you will get diminishing returns because you will just find the same issues as last time. You're not going to find anything new. So at that point, you either fix the issues or you don't really do any new playtests because you're not finding anything new.
Got it. So basically, the earlier the better, and
Yes.
the more you do it, the better. But at some time, they just
Yeah.
are not that relevant. All right, okay.
And it's more of a it's less that they're not relevant, it's more, do you actually have time to solve the problems that we pick up, right?
Mm-hmm,
If we come to like, if you take a game that hasn't had a lot of playtest in the early stages and you do a playtest like 2 months before release, and the players say, well, the results of the playtests are there weren't enough tutorials, or the players didn't manage to learn how the game mechanics worked. And it's like, how do you fix our onboarding is bad in 2 months before release?
And come on, get out of here. If you're playing the new Diablo game, you don't need money. You're playing the new Diablo game. I think that's cool in itself, right? For a lot of players, there's people who they don't have hobbies. They only play games. They only like games. Like that's their whole world. And if you tell them, hey, do you want to play the new Diablo and give your what you think, they're gonna do it. They don't care about money at all. So depending on the game, I think it would be easy to find players as well, right?
It's certainly easier when you have a big franchise that already has a big name. But also,
Yeah.
we don't usually tell the players that they're going to be testing our game,
Oh, okay.
like specific games. When I did an internship at the Ubisoft Research Lab a while ago, and the playtest announcements were more about the kinds of players we're looking for rather than the game we want people for,
Got it.
because we
Okay.
don't want to recruit only hardcore fans of the game, because the feedback that you're going to get is only going to be from these hardcore fans, which means that if you have anybody who is new to your game, new to the genre, they're going to be lost. Or anybody who's like mid level, if you cater your game to the hardcore players, the people who want actually to play the game and would be fine doing it for free, then all the rest of the people are left behind because, yeah, some hardcore gamers will be like, oh yeah, I already know how the mechanics of this thing works because I did it in the previous game. I don't need any explanation about that. And you're a new player, you just get into the game and you're like, how do things work? I don't know.
Okay. I remember, I think we were talking back in the days. I think you told me that certain playtests, they even track your eyes movements, right?
Yeah.
That's incredible.
Because again, people cannot be objectives. They cannot be purely objective about the way they've experienced things. Everything that you experience is colored by your bias, your predisposition, and you are not aware of everything that you do. Um, you won't be aware of every expression that you do with your face, everywhere that you have actually seen while you were moving your eyes and the things you were focusing on. And eye tracking is very good to tell us we had a message pop in, an important message. The players just didn't look at that part of the screen at all, which means that they missed the information. We need to do better. And usually that's something that you also find when you do an interview with the players and you ask them, did you get the message about the important thing? And the players go, what message?
All right, so it makes sense to track the eyes, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and you can track a lot of things. You can track, there's a few playtests that track the levels of stress by tracking the heart rate and the level of sweat on the skin of the players.
What? You're tracking levels? How are you doing that? You're putting those medical devices on their fingers?
Yeah.
What the fuck? What are you? Are you working on a horror game, Viviane, at Sumo?
No, I'm not involved in the playtest at Sumo, but I know that some playtests that were done by Ubisoft used these kinds of tracking because you want to know how stressed your player is. If you want to put like a very high stake, like intense situation, you want to know that it actually works as a high stake, intense situation, and that your players aren't just cruising by, sleeping.
Man, that's insane.
And yeah, it gives you a lot of information. There's a lot you can track. You can track the expressions of the face. There's a lot of scientific research that has been made about specifically what bit of expression, what does it mean, and there are software that allow you to kind of recognize like, oh, the player was like frustrated, frowning at that point, and they fully looked checked out at some point, and that's very useful for you as a researcher to be able to tell the developers, hey, at this point in the game, none of our players saw the message, and when they kept dying 5 minutes later, they all were fully checked out and frustrated. Here's the image. Here's the proof.
I think it helps, right, to see the image of the frustrated player.
Yeah, and it's mostly for the researchers themselves.
Right.
Usually, most developers won't have the actual like eye tracking data. It's just for the researchers. It's useful to be like, here's the heat map of where the players looked. Here's where they didn't look. And here's where you put your message.
All right. Yeah. So there are some games, like going back to the eye tracking movements, you said like the player didn't notice the message in a certain test, for example. Imagine you're playing World of Warcraft or any of those MMOs. How come, I cannot play those games, how come they have so many tiny informations and numbers and stats all over the place, all over the screens, about yourself, about your enemies, about your future enemies, or about your pet. I don't know how many kind of informations they can display, but they try to display so much. I cannot play those games. Why they do that? Because clearly it's not good at UX the way I understand it, because as humans, we can only pay attention to one thing at a time, right? If you try to have too much stuff going on at the same time, your brain just can't process. Maybe because I'm a man, I don't know. People say that men can't do two things at a time. I don't know, but
I think it's a case of, it's not a case of necessarily bad UX. It's their user experience is they want you to have to handle a bunch of information. And if that matches with their intended experience, that sometimes you're focusing on an enemy here while there's another coming in, and we're giving you the information, and it's on you to manage to see that bit of information. That's the challenge that they want to give to the players. And I also think there's another
Bad
aspect of it, which
UX.
is,
Bad UX a challenge that you want to give to the player.
yeah, it's only bad UX if it's not something that you intend to challenge the players with. Because good UX is helping the user do what they want as best as they want. If you go all the way to that point, if you go like at the absolute extreme, it good UX is a player pushes a button and they win the game. Because what the players want is to win the game. They push a button, they win the game. Because we're making video games, we need to put challenges to the players. But the important part is you have to figure out what you want to be difficult for the players. Same way, if you have a strategy game, maybe you want all the resources to be very clear. You have clear numbers so that the player knows exactly how their economy is doing, how their agriculture is doing. But maybe you want the hard part to be how do you like how do you manage when you have 25 things on the screen that go help, hey, that demand your attention. And in an ideal UX, you would press a button and all the resources would get smartly allocated to each of the things that need resources. If you do that in the game, you've kind of removed the game aspect of the game.
Makes totally sense. Makes totally sense. Now I understand it. Okay, so you need to kind of give the players something to manage. If you want to make the game, if you make the game too easy, then it's not a game anymore because you just press a button and the game is done.
It can be your intention to have something that is very reduced, like challenge and friction, but you need as a developer to be aware of where you want that friction, where you want that challenge. If you make a racing game, you want the challenge to be like how do I manage my acceleration and my braking and my turning at which point, and how do I manage my speed. So you want the speed to be clear, you want the controls to be easy to handle and not confusing for the players. You want the players to have just enough information about where their opponents are and how risky they need their moves to be. But you could also make another kind of racing game where the challenge is just managing to stay on the lane and follow a specific trajectory. That's another type of game with another type of challenge. So you're not gonna have the same user experience and the same things that you reduce the friction and increase the friction.
Makes sense. Makes sense. And what's crazy, the most crazy thing about it all is that, as far as I know, UX is a recent thing. It didn't exist a long time ago, right? Like when games. So you know more about it than I do.
Yeah,
So
it's a recent thing in game. It's not so recent in the web and stuff like that. It existed since the 80s or the 90s in web and interface. There's a lot of, and also it's the name specifically UX that is kind of recent and new. There's always been ergonomics and one of the key things about UX, which is affordances, which is the ability of an object to suggest its usage. So a door with a handle, you grab and you pull, and if there's only a plate, you push. That's concepts and things that have existed for a while. And that's not to say that the games before UX really became a thing had bad UX. There's a lot of games that had designers and people that were absolutely focused on how does the game feel for the players. It's just that in recent years they've kind of been like, we need a specific person that focuses on that, because as I mentioned, UX is everything. It's kind of the responsibility of every single developer. The game feel, the audio, the visual aspect of the enemies, like, the showing that in the character design there's a really big brownie guy with a lot of armor as part of the character design. That's making the player understand that this enemy is going to be a lot more of a challenge than the peasant with the like a little scythe who's like, eh. That's also part of the user experience, to just be able to look at these enemies and go, I'm gonna like hit the peasant first.
But when it became part of the game industry, though.
I don't have the actual date for that. It's been a process, I think, that kind of started with playtesting in a more standardized way. I want to assume that playtest happened before, but maybe it was more of a I call my five friends and they play the game and they give us what they thought of it.
All right. Yeah. Yeah.
And it's
I mean,
also very specific about bigger game companies, because smaller game companies do not have the time to hire the time or budget to hire a person specifically whose job is to run around and be like, I'm a UX.
if you want a good game experience, so you kind of need to do it.
Nah, not really, because again, UX is the responsibility of everybody. Uh, it's not just the UX designer who's like, I am responsible for players having a good experience in this game.
So if it's everybody responsibility, what the fuck do you do, Vivian? You just sit all day.
That's a good question.
That's not my Vivian. How we make this level better? That's not my responsibility.
Yeah, that's the thing is, designers have intentions that they want to achieve, and in an ideal world, you would have everybody who's always thinking about how does this thing that we just put in the game actually
Yeah,
experience for
yeah.
the players. When you have a bigger company, you have the time to have somebody whose specific role it is to do that, to just go back and coordinate with the people who are doing the user research, coordinate with the game directors to actually have what is the intended experience, and to check throughout the game that we're actually meeting that experience. And when you're in a smaller company, you can just have your regular designers just be also responsible for the user experience and just figure out on their own the solutions and the what is the problem and the solutions that we bring to it.
Yeah, makes sense.
And
So
in an ideal world, I would be out of a job.
don't say that. Come on. So you always need someone. Oh man, one sec. You always need the person because if you look at the programmers, the artists, the game designers, they are so focused on the game design, on the art, on the programming. They're not necessarily caring about the UX. Now that we know that UX is a thing, I think it's important to have someone who looks after it. You know.
Yeah, but I think also again, I'm I'm not a game designer. I'm not a level designer. I'm not an artist. All I can say is I think there's a problem here, and here's my suggestions on how we can fix it. There's a very high chance that somebody who's actually a game designer, somebody who's actually an artist, can come back and say, actually, we're gonna do it that way and still achieve the same thing, but in a better manner, in a better way. So it's all about collaboration. And as a UX designer, unless you and currently most of my job has been working as a UI UX designer. If you work as a person who's in the middle of everybody else, you don't necessarily do a lot of design yourself. You'll do a lot of analysis, a lot of a few recommendations, and then you take your recommendations. You talk to the actual people who are doing the actual work, and you're like, "Can we do this? Can we do that? What's the consequences of doing this and that?" You just have to be kind of aware of everything that everybody is doing, which is hard.
Watch full episodes of the Brewcast on the main YouTube channel, youtube.com/@brewfrasca.